Above the clouds, fame becomes fragile. 15 stars rose into the sky with dreams still burning bright, yet none of them returned. Their final flights became silent endings that the world never forgot, and tonight we follow the echoes they left behind.
Number 1. Aaliyah. She stepped onto the small Cessna under the warm Bahamian sun, unaware that the sky she trusted would become the stage of her final moments. Aaliyah had just finished filming the music video for Rock the Boat, a project meant to mark a new chapter in her career, one filled with maturity, confidence, and global reach. At only 22, she was already shaping the sound and image of modern R&B, carrying a quiet aura that drew people in effortlessly. Her team prepared for a quick return to Miami, eager to continue the momentum of her rising success. The plane lifted only a few hundred feet before beginning to falter, dipping sharply in a sudden loss of power. Witnesses saw it strike the ground and erupt into flames in a violent burst that ended 9 lives instantly. Investigators later revealed a devastating truth. The aircraft was overloaded with equipment, the weight far beyond safe limits, and the pilot was not licensed to fly commercially. From the moment the wheels left the runway, the tragedy had been sealed. The world lost a voice that was both soft and commanding, a performer who blended innocence with unmatched poise. Her death spread with unbearable speed. Fans gathered outside her label's offices, leaving candles and letters along the sidewalks. Directors and musicians spoke of her discipline, her humility, and the quiet wisdom that made her seem older than her years. Her performances with Timbaland, her impact on film through roles in Romeo Must Die and Queen of the Damned, and her futuristic musical style influenced an entire generation. Even now, artists echo her tone, her fashion, and her gentle strength. Aaliyah's final flight was meant to carry her home after a triumph. Instead, it became a reminder of how fragile brilliance can be, leaving behind a legacy that still grows long after her voice fell silent. Number 2. John Denver. He climbed into his experimental aircraft on a clear California afternoon, seeking the quiet freedom he always found in the sky. John Denver had long been more than a musician. He was a cultural symbol of warmth, optimism, and nature's beauty. With songs like Take Me Home, Country Roads and Annie's Song, he had become a global icon whose voice reminded millions of simplicity, love, and open landscapes. Flying was his greatest passion outside of music, a place where he felt weightless and restored. That day in 1997, he took off from Monterey Peninsula Airport for a casual solo flight, intending nothing more than a peaceful moment above the coast. Minutes after takeoff, something went terribly wrong. Witnesses on the shore saw the plane suddenly dip, roll, and plunge into the Pacific Ocean. Investigators later discovered that the fuel selector switch, placed in an awkward position behind his shoulder, made it nearly impossible to operate safely while in flight. Denver had attempted to switch fuel tanks at the wrong moment, losing control as the aircraft began to descend. The crash was instantaneous, leaving no chance for survival. At 53 years old, one of America's most beloved voices had been silenced in the same sky he cherished. The news struck the world with a wave of disbelief. Radio stations played his songs in round-the-clock tribute, and fans gathered in parks, churches, and open fields to sing along to the melodies he left behind. Friends described him as gentle, curious, and deeply connected to the world around him. His environmental activism, his humanitarian work, and his unwavering kindness painted a portrait of a man who never stopped giving. Hollywood and the music industry mourned him not just as an entertainer, but as a soul who brought light into dark moments. John Denver's final flight ended abruptly over the water he loved so much. Yet his voice continues to echo across generations, a reminder of how one man's music can make the world feel a little closer, a little softer, and endlessly alive. Number 3. Dean Paul Martin. He stepped into the cockpit of the F-4 Phantom II with the calm confidence of someone who had lived around greatness his entire life. Dean Paul Martin, the son of entertainment legend Dean Martin, had built his own identity far beyond the shadow of his father. As a teenager, he rose to fame in the music group Dino, Desi and Billy, later shifting toward acting with a quiet charm that won audiences over. But flying was his true passion, a calling he pursued with discipline and pride through the California Air National Guard. On a cloudy March day in 1987, he prepared for what should have been a routine training mission, unaware of the danger hidden behind the mountains ahead. Shortly after takeoff, his jet vanished from radar. Search teams combed the rugged terrain until they discovered wreckage scattered across the snowy slopes of the San Bernardino Mountains. Poor visibility and harsh weather had turned the flight into a deadly trap. The impact was catastrophic, leaving no survivors. Dean Paul Martin was only 35 years old, a young man with talent, ambition, and purpose carved into every new chapter of his life. The news shattered Hollywood and deeply wounded those who knew him, including his father, who never fully recovered from the loss. Tributes poured in from across the entertainment and military communities. Friends remembered his discipline, his humility, and his refusal to rely on the fame that surrounded his family name. He had starred in television series, appeared in films, and earned respect as a dedicated aviator who treated the skies with both awe and seriousness. Those who served with him spoke of his courage and professionalism, qualities that made him a natural leader. His death felt all the more tragic because he had already proven he was capable of succeeding on his own terms. Dean Paul Martin's final flight ended against a mountainside hidden in cloud, a heartbreaking close to a life defined by talent, heart, and determination. Yet his legacy remains: an artist, a pilot, and a dreamer who rose because he refused to stand still. Number 4. Joe Lara. He boarded the small Cessna Citation on a calm Tennessee morning, carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had spent decades moving between adventure and artistry. Joe Lara was best known to audiences around the world as Tarzan in Tarzan: The Epic Adventures, a role that showcased his athletic presence and rugged charisma. Before acting, he had worked as a model and musician, but it was his on-screen intensity that turned him into a recognizable figure throughout the 1990s. On May 29, 2021, he took off from Smyrna Airport with his wife and several members of their organization, intending to travel to Florida for an event that should have marked nothing more than another busy weekend. Minutes after takeoff, the aircraft climbed into low clouds, disappearing briefly into the gray sky before plunging sharply toward Percy Priest Lake. Witnesses heard a sudden boom, then silence. Rescue crews rushed to the scene, but the impact had been devastating. There were no survivors. Lara was 58 years old, a man whose life had been shaped by constant reinvention and relentless drive. The crash left Hollywood, Nashville, and countless fans stunned by the abruptness of a career and life that still had room to grow. Colleagues remembered him as disciplined, sincere, and deeply committed to every project he took on. His dedication to fitness, his curiosity about the world, and his willingness to take risks made him both a strong performer and an enigmatic presence. Beyond Tarzan, he starred in action films such as Steel Frontier and American Cyborg, carving out a niche as a reliable and physical actor who could anchor demanding roles. Later in life, he returned to music, releasing country songs that reflected his inner calm and storytelling spirit. Investigators later concluded that spatial disorientation in poor weather conditions likely caused the crash, a tragic reminder of how unforgiving the sky can be. Joe Lara's final flight ended in the quiet waters of a Tennessee lake,
but his presence remains in the memories of those who watched him leap, roar, and fight across the screen as a modern-day jungle hero. Number 5. Christian Oliver. He boarded the small single-engine plane with the casual ease of a man returning from a joyful family trip. Christian Oliver had spent days on the island of Bequia with his 2 young daughters, enjoying the ocean, the breeze, and a brief escape from the demands of film sets and international travel. Known for his roles in Speed Racer, The Good German, and Valkyrie, he had built a reputation as a versatile German-American actor whose discipline and warmth made him respected on both sides of the Atlantic. On January 4, 2024, he stepped onto the aircraft for a short flight toward St. Lucia, unaware that the sky he often admired would soon turn against him. Moments after takeoff, the plane began losing altitude over the shimmering Caribbean water. Witnesses on nearby boats saw it dip sharply, then vanish into the sea with a violent impact. Rescue teams reached the site quickly, but the wreckage told the full story. There were no survivors. Christian Oliver was 51 years old, and the crash claimed not only his life, but the lives of his 2 young daughters, a loss so devastating that it sent shockwaves through Hollywood and across Europe. The tragedy felt unbearably heavy, a sudden and cruel ending to a life defined by steady determination and boundless love for family. Tributes poured in from co-stars, directors, and fans who had grown familiar with his quiet intensity. He was admired for his dedication, his multilingual charm, and his ability to shift seamlessly between Hollywood productions and European cinema. Beyond acting, he had begun working on independent film projects, chasing stories that carried emotional depth and human truth. Friends remembered him as thoughtful, kind, and deeply committed to the people he cared about. His colleagues spoke of a man who brought integrity to every set, who worked tirelessly, and who never allowed success to dim his humility. Investigators later suggested that engine failure likely caused the crash, a reminder that even the calmest skies can hide fatal flaws. Christian Oliver's final flight ended far from the lights of Hollywood, but his legacy lives on through the characters he brought to life and the stories he left unfinished. Number 6. Stevie Ray Vaughan. He stepped onto the helicopter after a night of electrifying performances, his guitar still echoing in the minds of everyone who had watched him play. Stevie Ray Vaughan wasn't just a musician. He was a force of nature, a man who resurrected blues for a new generation and carved his name into music history with raw power and aching soul. His collaborations with legends, his spellbinding stage presence, and his unmistakable sound made him one of the most influential guitarists of the 20th century. On August 27, 1990, after a joyous jam session in Wisconsin, he boarded the flight meant to carry him to Chicago, ready to continue a tour filled with momentum and hope. Moments after liftoff, the helicopter climbed into thick fog that blanketed the hillside. Visibility was nearly non-existent as the aircraft ascended blindly into the darkness. Within seconds, it veered off course and struck the slope of a nearby ski hill with devastating force. There were no survivors. Vaughan was 35 years old, an age when many musicians are just beginning to find their voice, yet he had already created a legacy rivaling the greats. The suddenness of his death left the music world breathless, as though someone had extinguished a flame that had only started to burn at full strength. Tributes flooded in from across the globe. Fans left guitars, candles, and handwritten notes outside venues where he once played. Fellow musicians spoke of his generosity, his discipline, and the humility that grounded him despite his rising fame. He had battled personal demons, overcome addiction, and stood on the cusp of an artistic rebirth, making his loss even more heartbreaking. His album, Family Style, recorded shortly before his death, became a bittersweet reminder of what the future might have held.
Investigators later concluded that the pilot, unable to see the terrain due to the heavy fog, had flown the helicopter into the hillside in what is known as controlled flight into terrain. The tragedy underscored how quickly the skies can betray even the brightest spirits. Stevie Ray Vaughan's final journey ended in silence, but his music continues to roar with life, echoing through generations that still feel every note he left behind. Number 7. Reeba Drake. She stepped onto the small regional aircraft after a photo shoot and charity appearance, the kind of busy day she handled with effortless professionalism. Reeba Drake had built a career as both an actress and model throughout the late 1970s and 1980s, appearing in television commercials, supporting film roles, and editorial spreads that highlighted her striking beauty and warm screen presence. Her rising popularity made her a familiar face to audiences who followed fashion, daytime TV, and emerging talent in Hollywood. On a spring evening in 1991, she boarded a commuter plane for a short flight meant to return her home to Los Angeles, unaware of the mechanical danger lurking in the sky ahead. Shortly after takeoff, witnesses saw the aircraft climbing unsteadily, its engines sputtering as though fighting for life. Moments later, the plane lost power entirely and plunged toward a remote hillside outside San Diego. The impact shattered the fuselage, leaving no survivors. Reeba Drake was just 38 years old, a woman on the brink of expanding her acting career with new opportunities and broader roles. Her news stunned those who had watched her steady rise, especially colleagues who admired her dedication, humility, and ability to balance modeling and acting with a grace that felt rare and genuine. Tributes from co-workers, photographers, and small film directors painted a portrait of a woman whose kindness stood out even in a competitive industry. She was known for her generosity with young models, her patience on hectic sets, and her ability to create a sense of collaboration wherever she worked. Friends recalled that she had been preparing to audition for several larger roles, hoping to break into primetime television with the momentum she had steadily built. Her death ended not only a life, but the quiet promise of what might have been. Investigators later determined that an engine malfunction combined with maintenance oversights caused the crash, a preventable tragedy that underscored how fragile every flight can be. Reeba Drake's final journey ended on a silent hillside, but her presence remains captured in frames of film and photography, a reminder of a career poised to ascend just as the sky turned against her. Number 8. Otis Redding. He boarded the small Beechcraft twin-engine plane with the calm focus of a man who lived his life in motion. Otis Redding had just finished a series of performances with the Bar-Kays, pushing his voice to its limit the way only he could, raw, aching, powerful. At just 26, he was already considered one of the greatest soul singers of all time, a man whose presence could fill a room before he even sang a word. Dock of the Bay, the song he had recently recorded, hinted at a new musical direction, one that promised to reshape modern soul. On December 10, 1967, he took off from Cleveland, heading to Wisconsin for his next show, unaware that destiny had already rewritten his journey. As the plane approached Madison, the weather deteriorated rapidly. Freezing temperatures, fog, and heavy clouds wrapped the sky in a dangerous haze. Minutes before landing, the aircraft lost altitude and plunged into the icy waters of Lake Monona. Rescue teams reached the scene quickly, but the wreckage left little room for hope. Only one passenger survived. Otis Redding and several members of the Bar-Kays were gone. The world had lost a voice that sounded as old as heartbreak and as alive as fire. At 26, he had already changed the sound of American music, and the abrupt finality of the crash felt impossibly cruel. News of his death spread with the weight of a national tragedy. Radio stations across the country played his songs nonstop, and fans wept openly while listening to the voice that had carried them through love, loss, and longing. Fellow musicians described him as humble, driven, and astonishingly gifted. His posthumous releases, including Dock of the Bay, which became a global hit, only deepened the pain of what might have been. Decades of evolution, reinvention, and greatness cut short in a single winter afternoon. Investigators later concluded that the poor weather and low visibility were the primary factors in the crash. It was a reminder that even those larger than life remain fragile in the face of the sky's unpredictability. Otis Redding's final flight ended in cold, silent waters, but his legacy has soared far higher, carried in every soul singer who still borrows a piece of his sound. Number 9. Mayall. He boarded the small aircraft with the same restless energy that had defined his entire career. Mayall was one of Britain's most explosive comedic talents, a man whose chaotic brilliance reshaped television and inspired generations of performers. Known for The Young Ones, Bottom, Blackadder, and countless stage and screen roles, he had a presence that felt larger than life, wild, unpredictable, and irresistibly magnetic. In April 1998, he was traveling with a pilot friend when they lifted off for a casual flight over rural England, a journey meant to be peaceful and uneventful, far from the spotlight he had dominated for decades. As the aircraft crossed the countryside, a sudden mechanical failure forced an emergency descent. Witnesses later described seeing the plane lose altitude sharply before crashing into a field near Devon. The impact was severe, leaving Mayall with life-threatening injuries. Though he survived the crash itself, the event marked a turning point in his life, one that left him battling lasting health effects and confronting his own mortality. For years afterward, he spoke of the crash as a moment that reshaped his understanding of fragility, humor, and the strange balance between chaos and fate. But fate was not done with him. In 2014, after years of managing complications tied to the accident, Mayall died suddenly at the age of 56. Though not killed in the immediate crash, his death was forever linked to the incident that had nearly taken him years earlier, an echo of the sky's first attempt to silence him. Fans across the UK and around the world mourned the loss of a performer whose comedic genius had no equal. Tributes from co-stars and fellow comedians painted him as fearless, kind, and endlessly inventive. Mayall's brush with death in that plane left a permanent mark on his story, a reminder of how unpredictable life can be, even for those who spend their days making the world laugh. Number 10. Jim Croce. He boarded the small chartered Beechcraft plane after finishing a concert at Northwestern State University, his voice still ringing in the hearts of the crowd he had just moved. Jim Croce was more than a singer-songwriter, he was a storyteller, whose lyrics carried the weight of real lives, real heartbreaks, and the quiet poetry of everyday moments. With songs like Time in a Bottle, Operator, and Bad Bad Leroy Brown, he had risen from years of struggle into sudden, brilliant fame. On September 20th, 1973, he stepped onto the aircraft with his band and crew, preparing to fly to Texas for the next show, on a tour that was finally bringing him the recognition he deserved. Moments after takeoff, as the plane accelerated down the runway in the darkness, tragedy struck. The aircraft failed to gain proper altitude and collided with a tree located just beyond the airfield. The impact was catastrophic, killing everyone on board instantly. Croce was only 30 years old, a young father and husband on the brink of becoming a defining voice of American folk music. The news rippled through the music world like a cold shock, leaving fans and fellow artists stunned by the abrupt end to a life that had only begun to unfold. Tributes poured in as radio stations played his songs through the night, revealing the depth of what had been lost. Friends spoke of his kindness, his humility, and the determination that carried him through years of small bars, long roads, and unpaid gigs before success finally arrived. His lyrics reflected a rare ability to translate human vulnerability into melody, a skill that made listeners feel seen and understood. In the months that followed, posthumous releases, especially Time in a Bottle, became haunting reminders of the future he never reached. Investigators later confirmed that pilot error and poor visibility contributed to the crash, a combination that left no chance for recovery. Jim Croce's final flight ended on a quiet Louisiana night, but his songs continued to live with a pulse stronger than memory, carried by generations who still hear truth in every word he wrote.
Number 11. Big Bopper, J.P. Richardson. He boarded the small Beechcraft Bonanza on a freezing Iowa night, exhausted but determined to push through a brutal winter tour. J.P. Richardson, known to the world as the Big Bopper, had become a rising star in American music, blending humor, charisma, and a booming voice that made songs like Chantilly Lace unforgettable. He wasn't just a musician, he was a radio innovator, a songwriter, and a life-large personality who could light up any room. On February 3, 1959, he joined Buddy Holly and Ritchie Valens on a flight meant to spare them the misery of a long bus ride through the bitter cold. None of them knew the night would become one of the darkest in music history. Shortly after takeoff, the aircraft vanished into a swirling storm of snow and wind. Minutes later, it crashed into a frozen cornfield, killing all 4 men on board instantly. The news hit the world like a blow. Newspapers called it "the day the music died," a phrase that would become immortal. Big Bopper was only 28, a new father with dreams still stretching far ahead. Behind the jokes and the loud personality was a disciplined songwriter whose talent had already shaped the sound of early rock and roll. His future had promised evolution, experimentation, and even greater fame. Fans mourned him alongside the other fallen stars, leaving flowers, radios, and handwritten notes at the crash site. Musicians spoke of his kindness, his quick wit, and the way he made everyone around him laugh, even during grueling tours. His voice had an electricity that made even simple words feel alive, and his stage presence was unmatched, a performer who could command an audience before he even touched a microphone. Investigators concluded that poor weather and pilot inexperience in instrument conditions caused the crash, a reminder of how unforgiving winter skies can be. Big Bopper's final flight ended on a silent Iowa field, but his spirit lives on in every high-energy rock performance that follows the trail he helped carve. His laughter, his voice, and his fire are still felt more than 6 decades later. Number 12. Roberto Clemente. He boarded the aging Douglas DC-7 on a humid New Year's Eve in Puerto Rico, driven not by fame or obligation, but by compassion. Roberto Clemente was one of the greatest athletes the world had ever seen, a baseball icon whose talent, dignity, and humanitarian heart made him a global figure far beyond sports. Born in 1934, he became a legend with the Pittsburgh Pirates, 12 Gold Gloves, a World Series MVP, and over 3,000 career hits. But on December 31, 1972, he wasn't traveling for baseball. He was delivering aid to earthquake victims in Nicaragua, determined to ensure the supplies reached people who desperately needed them. As the plane prepared for takeoff, warnings were already in the air. Mechanical issues, overloaded cargo, questions about the pilot's qualifications.
Clemente knew the risks, but he also knew the suffering waiting on the other side of the flight. Moments after liftoff, the plane climbed unevenly, struggled for lift, and plunged into the dark waters off the Puerto Rican coast. Rescue teams searched through the night, then for days, but no bodies were ever recovered. Roberto Clemente was gone at just 38 years old, leaving behind a legacy built on both extraordinary talent and extraordinary humanity. The world responded with grief that crossed borders, languages, and generations. Tributes poured in from athletes, presidents, and everyday people who had seen in him a rare blend of grace and courage. Fans gathered at ballparks holding candles, while children across Latin America spoke his name as if he were a superhero. Clemente wasn't merely a baseball player. He represented hope, resilience, and the belief that those with power should use it for good. His death felt like a wound to more than a sport. It felt like a loss to the soul. Investigators later confirmed the aircraft had been dangerously overloaded and poorly maintained, a preventable disaster that stole one of the world's most selfless public figures. Roberto Clemente's final flight ended in the ocean he had grown up beside, but his spirit endured. Major League Baseball retired his number in honor of his legacy, and every year, players who embody his humanitarian ideals are celebrated in his name. For millions, he remains a symbol of heart, courage, and generosity that never touched the ground. Number 13. John F. Kennedy, Jr. He climbed into the small Piper Saratoga on a warm July evening, carrying the effortless charisma that had followed him since childhood. John F. Kennedy Jr. was more than the son of a president. He was a cultural figure in his own right, a lawyer, a publisher, an actor in early cameos, and a symbol of modern American elegance. His magazine, George, had reshaped political journalism with style and audacity, and his presence drew attention wherever he appeared. On July 16, 1999, he took off from Essex County Airport with his wife Carolyn and her sister Lauren, heading to Martha's Vineyard for a family wedding. It was a flight he had made before, a route he knew well, but the night sky held hidden dangers. As the plane moved over the Atlantic, visibility worsened. Darkness, haze, and the reflective surface of the water created a deadly illusion known as spatial disorientation. Pilots described it as losing the horizon, the moment your senses betray you and up feels like down. Minutes before the crash, radar showed the aircraft descending erratically. Then the signal vanished. When the Coast Guard located the wreckage days later, the heartbreaking truth became clear. There were no survivors. Kennedy was 38. Carolyn was 33. Lauren was 34. A young, vibrant trio silenced in an instant. The news stunned the nation. For many, it felt like another chapter in a family tragedy that had already stretched across decades. Crowds gathered in Boston and Washington, lighting candles and laying flowers beneath images of the couple. Friends and colleagues spoke of Kennedy's intelligence, warmth, and humility, qualities that made him approachable despite the weight of his last name. His magazine, George, had reshaped political storytelling with style and audacity, and his presence drew attention wherever he appeared. On July 16, 1999, he took off from Essex County Airport with his wife, Carolyn, and her sister, Lauren, heading to Martha's Vineyard for a family wedding. It was a flight he had made before, a route he knew well, but the night sky held hidden dangers. Number 14. Patsy Cline. She boarded the small Piper Comanche after finishing a benefit performance in Kansas City, her voice still echoing with the warmth and heartbreak that had made her a country music legend. Patsy Cline was only 30 when she recorded Crazy, I Fall to Pieces, and She's Got You, songs that redefined the emotional power of American music.
Her voice carried a richness that felt older than her years, a blend of vulnerability and strength that touched millions. On March 5, 1963, she climbed into the aircraft with fellow performers Cowboy Copas and Hawkshaw Hawkins, determined to return home to Nashville despite warnings of bad weather along the route. As the plane crossed Tennessee, the sky darkened into a violent storm. Heavy winds, low visibility, and sheets of rain created a dangerous landscape where even experienced pilots could lose control. Near Camden, the aircraft descended sharply and crashed into a wooded area, breaking apart on impact. There were no survivors. Patsy Cline was just 30 years old, a mother, a trailblazer, and a woman whose voice had only begun to show the depths it could reach. The loss felt immeasurable, not only for country music, but for every artist who had been inspired by her honesty, her fire, and her refusal to be anything less than herself. News of her death devastated Nashville. Radio stations played her songs non-stop, their lyrics suddenly infused with heartbreaking meaning. Fans gathered at the Opry and outside music halls, holding candles and pictures of the woman who had made them feel seen through her songs. Fellow musicians Loretta Lynn, Dottie West, Willie Nelson spoke of her generosity, her fearlessness, and the humor that often lit up backstage rooms long before she stepped onto the stage. She had fought through poverty, hardship, and a male-dominated industry to become one of the most influential voices of her era. Investigators later concluded that the storm and poor visibility caused the crash, a tragic reminder of how quickly the sky can turn against even the brightest stars. Patsy Cline's final flight ended in the quiet woods of Tennessee, but her voice continues to rise, strong, aching, unforgettable, through every singer who dares to pour their heart into a single note. Number 15. Thompson Collins. He boarded the small charter aircraft after a regional performance, carrying the easy confidence of a musician and actor who had spent decades on the road. Thompson Collins was known throughout the 1960s and early 1970s as a charismatic performer who blended music, television appearances, and stage roles into a career that connected him with audiences across the country. With a warm voice and a natural screen presence, he built a steady following through televised musical specials and guest roles that showcased both his charm and versatility. On the night of his final journey, he stepped onto the plane with fellow musicians, expecting nothing more than a short flight to their next venue. As the aircraft climbed into the night sky, weather conditions deteriorated quickly. Low clouds and unpredictable crosswinds created a disorienting environment where even small mistakes could become catastrophic. Minutes before the scheduled landing, the plane began descending too rapidly, veering off course and disappearing from radar. When search teams located the wreckage the next morning in a remote stretch of forest, the truth became painfully clear. There were no survivors. Thompson Collins was 40 years old, a rising talent whose career had promised further growth and evolution. The news shocked fans who had followed his work across television variety shows and concert tours. Colleagues remembered him as easygoing, disciplined, and deeply dedicated to his craft. He had been praised for his ability to connect with audiences, whether in intimate venues or through the warm glow of early color television. His death cut short a career that balanced both music and acting, a rare combination in an era defined by shifting trends and fierce competition. Many believed he was on the brink of broader recognition, poised for a breakthrough that might have led to starring roles and larger stages. Investigators determined that the crash was caused by a mix of poor visibility and pilot error, a tragic combination that left no opportunity for recovery. Thompson Collins' final flight ended in silence among the trees, but his legacy lives on through recordings, televised performances, and the memories of fans who saw in him a talent that could have soared much higher.